New all-time highs yet again in the S&P 500. We just barely missed this 6100 strike. You can see from our chart, this is the largest gamma exposure concentration at the 6100 level. As soon as we approached that zone, dealer selling pressure kicked in and we immediately retraced back down to 6080 before closing at the 6090 strike. So if we just zoom back out here, you can actually see how close our dealer cluster zones are to each other. Most of this gamma exposure at the 6090 strike is actually going to be rolling off come Monday morning. That is mostly negative gamma exposure from the softness that we saw during the afternoon on Friday. And so once all that negative gamma exposure rolls off, the 6050 strike is really going to be our main focus for next week on the downside. So any kind of softness in the market, the 6050 strike would be our first target. And that's actually just a natural zone here on the chart. You can see it's a gap left over from December 4th, and it was resistance here the last several days in November and into December. So that's actually just a natural technical zone, as well as where market participants are positioned at the 6050 strike on the downside. So how do we actually know that all this GEX at the 6090 strike is going to be rolling off? Well, if we come down to our 3D surface, we can actually see where the gamma exposure is by expiration date, and we can go out in time and see where the biggest concentrations are. Obviously, you see this huge negative spike down here. That's the 6090 strike, as I mentioned, expiring on Friday. And so that's going to allow the market to kind of open up and focus on different strikes as potential targets. And so the market is naturally going to start, gravitating to some of these other strikes. You can see the 6100 strike still in focus for December 20th. And so that's been our main focus for the last several weeks. We've essentially hit that level, as I mentioned earlier, on Friday. And so what we're watching for now is how the gamma exposure concentrations are growing at the 6150 and the 6200 strikes. For now, those are still distant targets. This 6100 level is still the main area. And our thesis is that as long as the structure remains as is, any buying that comes above 6100 is going to be met with dealer selling pressure from our dealer cluster up here. Dealers will likely be selling the underlying, in the case of the S&P 500, is going to be futures. So they'll be selling those futures in order to hedge their option positions. And so that's going to naturally have some pressure to the downside on any move above 6100. The only thing that can offset that, though, is if we see GEX growing at these higher strikes. That would actually signal to us that call buying is coming into the market up here at higher strikes, and that could overwhelm that dealer selling pressure. So as of now, this is kind of a high pressure sell zone above the 6100 strike. So something to keep in mind as we enter into trading on Monday and Tuesday especially. Now, why has the market overall been so strong? Well, to answer that, we can take a look at the Qs. The Qs closing Friday 525.82, new all-time highs on the Qs here. And this is something we noted a couple of weeks ago before Thanksgiving. We had not reached all-time highs again after this dip, but the S&P 500 was breaking all-time highs at that point. So that divergence told us something, that either the market was topping, or if the Qs could continue to see momentum, that this was just going to add fuel to the fire into year end. Ultimately, that's what happened. We broke above this 515 level. Our bias for the past couple of weeks was that the Qs would, in fact, break out above this level. And why did we think that? Well, mostly because we had positive gamma exposure between 515 and 535 going back 2, 3, 4 weeks even. And so even though the Qs were a laggard back here in mid-November compared to the S&P 500, the momentum that we were seeing off of these lows suggested that gamma effects would kick in, especially as we came back here and approached this 515 level, which was a previous all-time highs back in early November. And so once we got to that level, of course, a week and a half ago, and we broke out, it was off to the races. So we're seeing a similar picture here in the Qs. we are approaching our upper dealer cluster zone. We see some gamma exposure growing at the 530 strike, but at the same time, this 525 to 530 range is likely to be met with dealer selling pressure, dealers selling shares of the underlying in both the Qs and Nasdaq futures, forcing price lower. So what we want to watch for is call buying coming in at these higher strikes in the options market. That would signal an overwhelming force where that would basically be offsetting dealer selling pressure from this 525 and kind of 527 zone here. So that's what we're going to be watching for again heading into next week. Now let's take a look at a few key names in this market. First, we'll start off with Palantir. Palantir will not stop going higher, closing at 77.50. Most investors thought this could not go higher than 65. The gamma exposure a couple of weeks ago was showing us that 65 was a major area of contention. That has now been overwhelmed by market momentum, by call buying activity, by investors just pouring into the stock. So we did see a pause here at the 65 zone, but we saw continued call buying coming in. Here's our volume, 200,000 contracts, just for example, on Friday at the 75 strike, and well over nearly 150,000 contracts at the 80 strike. So market participants are still bullish. We're definitely approaching the next level here in our dealer cluster zone. And interestingly enough, you can see how our lower dealer cluster zone has now moved up to the 65 strike. So this was our previous upper dealer cluster zone. So we call this G1 and this G2. So our G1 level has moved up, was previously at 65, now it is at the 80 strike. And our G2 levels also moved up. Now this is essentially a support zone down here at the 65 strike. You can see the gamma exposure between 75 and 80, basically vying for supremacy. The 80 strike is currently winning out. That could be a potential target early next week. We'll see. I do expect selling pressure to be intense when it does kick in. Next, let's jump over to Tesla. Tesla approaching the big 400 strike, nearly hitting it on Friday. This zone here at the 350 strike, this now has become our zero gamma exposure level, this blue line. And Tesla now approaching the big 400 gamma exposure concentration. This looks likely to get tagged next week. We are less than $10 away from that. This is actually a post-market Friday after hours price here that was grabbed, 394. I think the close was at 389. Either way, we are very, very close to this 400 level. So we'll be watching that next week for a potential tag. Next, let's take a look at Nvidia. Nvidia seeing some weakness on Friday, down 2%, coming back towards the 141, 142 zone. We had a really nice bounce here the week of Thanksgiving. So it's approximately just below 132 here, and rallied all the way above the 145 strike. That was a big level. We really needed to see a move above 140, which we got early December 1st and December 2nd. We needed to see a breakout above that for this 150 GEX level to come back into play. So we basically hit all the targets, 140 and 145 breakouts here. We did see some rejection, but I think this 150 strike is still a likely target into year end. Doesn't mean it's going to be straight up though. You can see the volatility on Nvidia is really starting to pick up here. Price really hasn't gone anywhere for basically the last month. And so this tells us that market participants are looking elsewhere for outsized opportunities in the market. But I do think market participants are going to make one last effort, collectively speaking, to hit this 150 strike yet again prior to year end. Remember, you can access all of our gamma exposure tools and our option flow analytics by heading over to geeksoffinance.com. I'll put a link in the description below for that. You can also join our community Discord. We've got a ton of great traders in there discussing their ideas, different strategies, and we post a number of setups and market analysis throughout the trading session. So you definitely want to check that out when you get a chance. I'll put a link in the description below for that as well. Thanks so much everybody for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video.